The door was latched open. The engines were still humming. On the dashboard, 2 half-eaten sandwiches sat next to a set of flight logs that hadn't been touched in over an hour. Everything inside the cabin suggested that the pilots were just there, yet when the blimp finally collided with a suburban house in Daly City, the gondola was completely empty. No bodies, no blood, and no sign of a struggle. Just a silent, drifting ghost. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams were seasoned professionals on a routine anti-submarine patrol. The morning was clear, the winds were predictable, and they were flying over one of the most heavily monitored stretches of coastline in the world. Yet, somewhere between the Farallon Islands and the Golden Gate Bridge, 2 men simply ceased to exist. They left behind their parachutes, their life rafts, and a mystery that has baffled investigators for 80 years. The flight of the L-8 began at 6 in the morning from Treasure Island. It was a standard mission to search for Japanese submarines lurking near the San Francisco Bay. For the first hour, everything was textbook. They radioed in their position, reported a suspicious oil slick on the water, and descended to investigate. It was the last time anyone heard their voices. After that, the radio went dead, and the blimp began a strange, erratic journey toward the mainland. But here is the detail most historians ignore: they were seen. Thousands of feet below, several civilian vessels watched the blimp descend toward the water. The witnesses reported seeing the aircraft hover just 30 feet above the waves, circling the oil slick as if the pilots were looking for something specific. Then, suddenly, the L-8 surged upward, climbing rapidly into the clouds. It was a maneuver that indicated either a sudden emergency or a panicked realization. What did they see in that water? As the hours ticked by, the Navy grew frantic. Search planes were scrambled, but the blimp was nowhere to be found, until it emerged from the fog banks over the city. It wasn't flying, it was drifting, partially deflated and sagging like a wounded animal. It bounced off a cliffside, losing its depth charge in the process, and then floated silently over the rooftops of Daly City. Crowds gathered in the streets, watching the giant silver bag scrape against chimneys and telephone poles. When the blimp finally came to rest on Bellevue Avenue, the scene was surreal. The gondola had landed perfectly upright. There was no fire, no explosion, and the structure was largely intact. Rescuers rushed to the cabin, expecting to find the pilots unconscious from some sort of gas leak or engine failure. They tore open the door, which was already partially unlatched, only to find the interior bathed in a haunting, mechanical silence. The seats were empty. The men were gone. The investigation began immediately, and the findings only deepened the mystery. The blimp's radio was in perfect working order. If the pilots had been in trouble, a single button press could have summoned help. Their life jackets, which Navy regulations required them to wear at all times over water, were still stowed in the cabin. Most importantly, the 2 parachutes were exactly where they should have been. If Cody and Adams had jumped, they had done so without any survival gear. But then things got even weirder. A search of the logs revealed no mention of any trouble. The last entry was a routine coordinate check. Investigators looked for signs of a fight, but everything was in its place. The fuel valves were open, the engines were capable of running, and the only thing missing was the crew. This led to the first major theory: a sudden, catastrophic fall. Could one pilot have leaned out to inspect the oil slick, fallen, and the other jumped in to save him? The one-man overboard theory was the Navy's favorite, but it had a massive hole. The door was locked from the inside with a latch that was found in the open position. If one man had fallen, why would the second man stay on board for hours before also disappearing? And if they both fell at the oil slick, how did the blimp stay aloft and travel for miles before crashing? Witnesses saw the blimp climbing after the oil slick encounter, implying someone was still at the controls. As the war raged on, rumors of a Japanese submarine kidnapping began to circulate. Some believed that Cody and Adams had spotted a sub, were forced to land on the water, and were taken prisoner. This would explain the oil slick and the hovering. However, there was no evidence of a submarine in the area at that time, and the logistical nightmare of a sub-crew boarding a blimp in a choppy ocean without leaving a single mark on the aircraft makes this theory nearly impossible. The theory the Navy tried to bury involved a top-secret experiment. In 1942, the military was testing all sorts of radar and communication equipment. Some investigators suggested that a third person, an unauthorized civilian or a secret agent, was on board and that a conflict broke out. This third man theory explains why the door was open, but there's no record of anyone else boarding the flight, and the weight limits of the L-8 were extremely strict. Every pound was accounted for. The most unsettling possibility is the internal conflict theory. Ernest Cody and Charles Adams were friends, but the stress of the war was immense. Could a sudden argument have turned violent? If one pilot killed the other and dumped the body, he would then have to dispose of himself to avoid a court-martial. But again, the cabin was pristine. There were no blood spatters, no signs of a struggle, and the sandwiches were left untouched. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the air. Wait, there is one final piece of evidence that surfaced years later. A witness on a nearby beach claimed they saw a small yellow object fall from the blimp shortly after it rose from the oil slick. The Navy searched the area but found nothing. Was it a piece of equipment, or was it the first pilot's life vest? If they weren't wearing their vests, falling into the cold Pacific meant certain death within minutes. But if they fell, why did the blimp climb so aggressively afterward? Modern aviation experts have suggested a more scientific answer: carbon monoxide poisoning. A leak in the engine could have filled the small cabin with odorless, colorless gas. Confused and hallucinating, the pilots might have opened the door for fresh air and simply stumbled out. It's a rational explanation, yet the investigators at the time checked the engines and found no leaks. Furthermore, the radio was on. If they were feeling sick, why didn't they call for help before they lost consciousness? The L-8 was eventually repaired and put back into service. It became known as the Ghost Blimp among the crew, a cursed vessel that carried the weight of 2 missing men. It flew for the rest of the war without incident, but the mystery of that August morning never faded. The Navy officially closed the case, listing the cause of disappearance as unknown. But how does a state-of-the-art military craft lose its entire crew in broad daylight with witnesses watching? Every 30 to 60 seconds of this investigation, we find a new contradiction. The blimp hovered, then it climbed. The door was open, but the parachutes were inside. The engines worked, but the radio stayed silent. It's an impossible puzzle where every piece of evidence cancels out the last. Even the timing is strange. The entire event from the last radio contact to the crash spanned less than 5 hours. In that short window, 2 lives were deleted from the world. Some believe the answer lies in the oil slick. In 1942, the presence of oil often meant a submarine was nearby, but it could also mean a sunken wreck. If Cody and Adam saw something truly inexplicable in the water, something that wasn't a submarine, could the shock have led to a fatal mistake? There are reports of unidentified sightings in the bay during the war years, though most are dismissed as wartime hysteria. But for 2 pilots, the mystery was very real. Is it possible they are still out there? For decades, beachcombers along the California coast have looked for any sign of the men. A dog tag, a piece of a flight suit, a bone. Nothing has ever been found. The ocean is a vast graveyard that keeps its secrets well. If they fell near the Farallon Islands, the currents would have carried them out into the deep Pacific, far away from any hope of recovery. Their disappearance remains the only ghost ship story of the air. The families of Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams never received a clear answer. They were left with a stack of redacted documents and a missing in action notice. Every year on the anniversary of the crash, small groups of aviation enthusiasts gather in Daly City to discuss the case. They look at the photos of the gondola sitting on the street and try to imagine what those last moments were like. What were the men thinking as they looked at the open door? As we look back at the evidence, we are forced to confront the limits of history. Sometimes, the records don't exist. Sometimes, the witnesses see what they want to see. And sometimes, people just vanish. The Ghost Blimp is a reminder that even in an age of radar and constant communication, the world can still swallow a human being without leaving a trace. It is a story of silence, the silence of the radio, the silence of the cabin, and the silence of the sea. To this day, the case of Navy Flight 101 remains one of the greatest aviation mysteries in American history. It challenges our understanding of logic and leaves us with a chilling question that may never be answered. In those 5 hours over the California coast, where did they go? Was it an accident, a crime, or something we simply can't explain? The blimp came home, but the men who flew it are still out there, drifting in the fog of history.